Hello everyone, welcome to our new tutorial. Today we will be discussing capital in depth. Basically this session is part of a series where we will be discussing about Basel regulations in details, and we'll do some practical modeling to make sure that the concepts are crystal clear and we are able to visualize how things works in a bank. So this will be the sequence of discussion. We'll be starting with capital in today's session. Today's session is dedicated entirely to capital, because what we have realized is when we have discussed with on jobs, not only in colleges but even with professionals, and when we ask them to explain capital in a layman term, so if you have to explain capital to a non-banking person or non-finance person, people struggle. They basically are not very clear with what exactly is capital, what is the difference between capital, money, funds and all those things. So we'll be covering that, and then in subsequent sessions we'll be covering Basel 1, Basel 2, Basel 3 and even Basel 4, and we'll also do some modeling around provisions and Basel requirements. We are focusing so much on Basel because that's pretty much the single most important topics for your exams as well as jobs. So FRM is a very practical exam. So by practical I mean the highest weightage is given to the topics that are most widely used within the jobs. So weightage of a topic is directly proportional to probability of you working on that topic in your job, and especially if you land up in a job of risk manager, you can be 100% sure that you will be working around Basel regulations. So we want to spend a lot of time on Basel regulation, but let's start with capital. So what is the need of such strong regulations for banks? Answer is number one, to avoid bank failures. When we say avoiding bank failures, we don't want banks. So the business of banks is to take money from people who have excess money in form of deposit and then give to people who want money in form of loans, and we don't want a scenario where bank is unable to give back money to depositors. There could be various reasons why bank may not be able to return the money back to depositors. One of them, probably the most important one, is your NPS, which is basically your non-performing asset, or also called as defaults, wherein you have given loan to a corporate or an individual and they basically fail to return back your loan. So we want to avoid such scenarios where a default by one party does not lead to collapse of entire bank. Second thing is to avoid public confidence crisis leading to bank runs. So basically what happens is, let's say a bank fails, that is, it does not return back money to its lenders and depositors. So what happens is, people all of a sudden panics, and let's say not only one bank, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5 banks start failing. Then what happens is, people lose confidence in banking sector and they immediately try to take out money from the bank, which basically again put bank on a stress, and they may, since let's say I have a deposit of 100 rupees and if I see a lot of banks have failed, my initial thought would be, let's take out my 100 rupees from my bank before it also fails. In case it does not fail, later on I'll deposit it back, but as of now let's just be safe and take out my money. So that is the mentality which is basically general public has. Now if everybody starts withdrawing their money from bank will not be able to return that money, because that most of that money is basically given in form of loans. So bank can only give certain amount of money. It may not be able to give money to all the people at one go. So it's very important to ensure public has confidence on banking system, otherwise there will be bank runs. Other thing is to avoid systematic economic collapse. So let's say one bank fails. That one bank may have lot of transactions with another bank, so their money also gets stuck. They may not be able to give money back to their depositors or lenders. Similarly, the second bank may depend upon third bank for some part of their funding in form of, let's say, repo or interbank borrowing. So even in that case, one bank failure might lead to another bank's problem, might lead to another bank's failure. Now if so many banks start failing, basically your entire economy gets stuck. Reason being, corporates who wants loan to run their factories, to run their business, to expand their business, to purchase inventory, they won't be able to get loans because banks are failing, they don't have money. And if corporates are not getting loans, your industries starts winding up. There, not only your industry start winding up, normal public won't be able to get loans for let's say homes, purchasing homes, cars. So your real estate sector goes down, your automobile sector goes down. So in a way, entire economy goes down. Your big corporates goes down because they are not able to borrow money. Your automobile sectors, your real estate sector goes down. There is a massive unemployment. That unemployment again reduces the willpower of people to go and spend. So let's say even your FMCG gets impacted. So all of these industries gets impacted and there is a systematic economic collapse. So that's why there is a very, 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 very strong focus on regulating banks. It is not only one of the, it is the most regulated sector in the economy in any country across the world. Okay. Then the next question that comes up is, if banks are so important, why can't just government bail them out? Why do we need such big banking regulations that needs to be followed by all the banks? So if let's say XYZ bank is so important, then why not just government bail it out? Now, if you see the money that government has, it is basically taxpayers' money. So there will be a public discontent. So if I don't have any transactions with let's say bank XYZ, which is which is on verge of failure, most likely I will not want my taxes to be used to save that bank. And if you see market share of banks in a good economy, let's say India, Europe, US, so all the big economies, you will see there are 10 to 15 banks. All of them have 5 to 10% of market shares. So if any bank fails, rest of the 90 to 95% of people will not want their taxes to be used to save that bank because they are not directly getting impacted. Second thing is, there is always a political discontent, especially in democracies. We will not talk about countries like China, but the major economies of the world are democracies which has government as well as opposition. So opposition will start pressurizing government as in that government is misusing taxpayer money and government is corrupt and all those things. It can't handle public money and all those things. All those accusations will start coming up and there will be political discontent. Second thing is moral hazard. What exactly is moral hazard? So when a bank fails and if government just bails it out, the next time all the other banks will not be serious about risk management. They will simply write more risky loans. They will simply give away more risky loans. They will simply write more risky derivatives. And in a way, entire risk in the entire banking sector increases. And then there will be not only one bank failure, there would be down the timeline there will be another bank's failure, then another bank failure, and government will be expected to bail all of them out with the taxpayer money. If government only bails out one bank, then there will be again a political discontent and opposition will claim that government is doing favor to a certain corporate house or certain bank, and there would be like corruption charges and all those things will come up. So you can see moral hazard, especially in insurance, this is a very important concept. So if I have a home insurance, or let's say not me, but let's say a small institute or a small shop has a insurance, they will not be very serious about safety of that shop because they know they will get their money back even if something wrong happens. If I don't have insurance for my shop, I'll have CCTV cameras, I'll have best of electrical wiring, I'll have fire safety equipments, everything available in my shop. But as soon as I take insurance, there is a complacency on general public. So that's the general human behavior, that they will get complacent, and that basically is what moral hazard is. Okay. So then what is the solution? Answer is capital. Let's see what capital exactly means. Now let's consider this scenario where this is our bank and it has two customers. Just for simplicity, it has two customers and both have given them 100 deposit in form of term deposits, or which is also called as fixed deposit in various countries, and in other countries it is called as term deposit. And bank is supposed to pay 5% interest on these deposits, and this deposit is for 1 year. Now bank uses these $200 to give away loans. That is the business of bank. Take money, give money, earn margin in between. So bank gives loans to various customers. In our example, let's say 3 of them. To first customer it has given 50 at 10%. Let's say it is a car loan and for 1 year. Second person it has given 75 at again 10%, so for 1 year personal loan. Again 75 at 10% for 1 year at for education loan. Now for simplicity we have not taken a mismatch on maturity. Generally your assets are long dated, your liabilities are short dated, which basically means your deposit are short term and your loans are long terms. But to avoid any confusion, let's say it is a perfect match for now. Okay. Now let's see a scenario where one of the person defaults, and this is gonna happen. Means when we are in business of lending, not entire 100% of your people will be able to pay back your loans. However strong your risk management practices are, not 100% people will pay back your loans. So there will be always some defaults. So if you give loans to 1000 people, there may be 1% people who will not be able to pay for various reasons. Maybe their company, they have taken a corporate loan and their company is no more profitable. Maybe an individual have taken a loan and they have lost the job. Maybe there is an economic down cycle, there is a recession, maybe there is a calamity, there is flood, etc. Maybe person has lost his life, they may not be able to repay now. So there are tons of reasons why somebody may not be able to pay loans. Some of the people may not pay loans just because they don't want to pay loans, which are also called as willful defaulters. They are defaulting not because of a problem, they are defaulting willfully. They take loans from bank and they run away with that money. So there are tons of reasons why people may not be able to pay back their loans. So with every bank there will be some probability and some percent of people that may not be able to pay back their loans. Okay, so let's see the cash flows of bank after 1 year. So bank owes, how much bank owes? The entire principal to depositors, which is 100 plus 100, that is 200, and then it needs to pay the interest amount also, so which is 5% of 200, that is 10. So your total money that bank owes is 210. How much money bank has? These two people pay back their loans, so you get 75 plus 75 as principal, 10% interest on 75 plus 75, so basically 10% interest on 150, that comes out to be 15. So your 150 plus 15, and let's say this person has taken car loan and bank has taken control of the car and they have sold it off. But you know, old car will never fetch you as much money as new car does. So let's say this car was purchased for 50, but when after 1 year bank goes to sell it, they are only able to recover 25. So they get 25. So this comes out to be 190. So now bank can only service one person and they won't be able to service another person. So basically bank is not able to pay back money to all its depositor. Reason, what exactly it leads to? It leads to bankruptcy. It leads to bankruptcy. Okay. Now this is where exactly bank capital comes into picture. So let's say bank has a capital of $50. Now as of now you can consider this capital as bank's own money. Okay. So this is basically bank's own money. So now let's see the cash flows. Bank owes 210. Bank had 190 from its business and then 50 from its capital. So bank has 240. It has no problem in paying back its depositors. So that's why capital is so very important for banks. So what makes up capital? We are not going into a complete exhaustive list of instruments that make up the capital, but this is broad classification of what makes up the capital. Most important is basically bank's previous profit. So let's say bank was profitable in last 3 years and it has earned profit of 100 in last 3 years, 100 in last 3 years each, so its reserves and surplus basically becomes 300. Then you have equity, which is your owner's money, which basically your promoters and shareholders have put in the company. So these two put together are also called as tier 1 capital. And then the third thing is subordinate debt, which is basically called as tier 2 capital. Tier 1 capital is basically the highest quality capital. This is bank's own money. Bank's own money, right? Nobody is going to take it back. shares once purchased, they always remain in market. It can only be transferred from one person to another, but nobody can come to bank and say give me back my money and take back your shares. Only thing that you can do is you can exchange or you can sell those shares on an exchange, stock exchange basically, where somebody else will buy those shares from you, and bank is not at all impacted. So this is your bank's money. Okay. Subordinate debt is basically nothing but debt. It's same as debt, but only thing is your lender has less rights on recovery. What it means is, in case of a default, first one to get paid is your depositors, second one to get paid is your normal debt holders, and then third one to get paid is subordinate debt. So this is not exactly bank's own money. Bank needs to pay it back, but then there is no obligation on banks if it does not pay it back. I mean, saying no obligation is not the correct word, but just to give you an idea why this is called as capital. Because your lender is willing to take that risk that even in case of default, I will be the last one to get money back. And in return, generally if a normal debt is, let's say, fetching 10%, this debt will fetch 12%. So this is like a conscious decision by lender saying that I want to earn extra return, and to earn that extra return, I am ready to take a risk that in case your bank fails, I will have the last claim on the funds. So that's why this is called as capital, but since it is not bank's own money, so this is called as tier 2 capital. So tier 1 capital is basically the highest quality capital, and tier 2 capital is good quality, but it's not bank's own money. Okay, now the next important thing is how much capital to have. So we'll see this with an example. In previous example, we have just taken a random number that bank has a capital of 50, but then how do bank reach to that number of 50? We'll just discuss the pointers. Once we get deep dive into Basel, we will go into details of how exact amount of capital is calculated. Okay, so let's say bank has given loans of 100 at 10%, and it has used deposit of 100 at 8% to give these loans. Now bank needs to have capital, which we have seen in previous examples, that why capital is important to avoid bankruptcy. So bank has capital of 10, 5 in form of equity and 5 in form of past profits or reserves. Now since your capital is basically your owner's money or your bank's money, capital is bank's own money, that's what we have discussed. And who owns the bank? Basically your shareholders. Now shareholders have not invested in company without any expectation. They expect returns. Let's say owner of this bank expect 10% dividend on the capital. Okay, so that's why we have written capital at 10%. Okay, now this money will not lie idle in banks. As per regulation, these money can be invested in government bonds, in liquid government bonds, which are generally short dated. So short dated loans will have very less interest rate also. So let's say this amount of 10 has been used by bank to buy bonds, and it has bought bonds of 10 at, let's say, 5%. So this is basically your bank's balance sheet. Now let us look at their P&L. which is profit and loss statement. So from loans they have earned 10, from bonds they have earned 0.5. Similarly, from deposit they need to pay 8, and for capital equity they need to pay 0.5, and for reserve also they need to pay 0.5. So your net income is 10.5 minus 9, basically your 1.5. Now the two most important ratios, return ratios, that are used for valuing a stock price or valuing a company is ROCE and ROE, which is also called as ROCE and ROE, which is return on capital employed, that is ROCE, ROCE, and return on equity. So from balance sheet and P&L we can see your return on capital employed is your net profit. As the name says, it is return on capital employed. So your return is 1.5 on capital of 10. So your ROCE is 15%. And your return on equity is 1.5 divided by only the equity part of your capital, which becomes your 1.5 divided by 5, that becomes your 30%. Okay. Now let's see what happens if bank has too much of capital. Let's say bank is very conservative. It does not want any risk of bankruptcy. So it decides to have lots and lots of capital. So it basically, our bank decides to double up the equity that it has. So you can't change the reserves because they are your past profits. So you can't change what has happened in past. But your owners says that fine, we'll double up the equity capital that bank has. So from 5 your equity capital goes to 10, and rest of the example is same. Another change is your bonds. Now you have capital of 15, so you want to purchase bond of 15 at again 5%. So rest everything is same. So if we see net income now, you are earning 10 from loans as in previous example. From bonds you are now earning 0.75 because you are investing more principal. From deposit you need to pay 8 as in previous example. Now the equity capital has changed, so you pay 1, and then for reserve is still same, so you pay 0.5. Now your net income becomes 10 plus 0.75, which is 10.75, minus 8 plus 1 plus 0.5, which is minus 9.5. Your net income becomes 1.25. Now your ROCE or ROCE becomes 1.25 divided by your total capital, which is 15 now. It's not 10 anymore, it's 15. So your ROCE becomes 8.3 and ROE becomes 12.5. So you see they have doubled up the equity capital, and you see your ROCE is from 15, it has gone down to almost 8, and ROE from 30, it has gone down to 12.5. Now since your return ratios have deteriorated by half, ideally your share price will also reduce by half. It may not reduce by half because investors will see, some of the investor will say fine, this bank is very safe, but then that's not only what investors are looking for. Investor or traders, they want company to grow, they want company to have good return ratios, they want company to be more and more profitable and share prices to increase. So the entire fall may not, share price fall may not be entire 50%, it may be 20%, 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever. And a share price drop directly impacts your shareholders, which is basically the owners of the company. So having too much of capital will basically means your shareholders or your owners of the banks are losing money in form of share prices. And second thing is, this entire amount of 5, this additional amount of 5, instead of being blocked into capital, could have been used for giving loans, which would have mean they would have earned much better profits. Okay, so let's say case 2, let's say owner says, no, I want higher share price, so let me reduce the capital. So let's see what impact it has on balance sheet. Now again, your loans and deposits remain same. Your equity capital from 5 initially, in first example it went to 10, in second example it goes down to 2. Okay, and your reserve remain same because they are like your past profits, so it can't be changed. Now let's see the balance sheet. Your loans has 10, you are earning 10 from loans, you are giving 8 to depositors. Now your bonds, you are investing only 7 because that's your capital, so you are getting 0.35 here, and the payment to equity holders is 0.2 and to reserve is 0.5. So your net income comes out to be 10.35 minus 8.7, which basically is 1.65. Now your ROC becomes 1.65 divided by entire capital, which is 7 in our case now, and then your ROE becomes 1.65 divided by 2 because your equity is 2 now, so it comes out to be 82.5. So from initial 15 and 30%, it comes out to be 23.5 and 82.5%. So looking at this, share prices should ideally increase, but then if shareholders think, or not shareholders, but let's say investor thinks that this is way too little capital and it is way too risky to invest in this bank, they may not be expecting only 10% return. They may be expecting 25% return because risk is directly proportional to return expected. Risk is not directly proportional to return. Risk is directly proportional to expected returns. And generally we have seen that risk is inversely proportional to returns. But when we talk about expected return, risk and expected returns are directly proportional. More the risk you take in real world investing, generally you will lose more money. But for theory, more risk you take, you expect more return. At least you expect more return. Whether you get it or not, that's an entirely different thing. Okay, so too much capital will increase the owner expectation of return they want from their money. Also, it increases the risk of bankruptcy on the bank. So that's why regulators have framed certain regulation, which are basically Basel 1, 2, 3 and 4, to come up with what exactly should be the capital amount. Now capital amount, now there's one more concept before we go to next thing. There is a regulatory capital where, let's say in our example, it says fine, you are not able to decide whether to have 5, 10 or 2. Here regulator comes in and analyzes your bank and say flat, we want you to have, since you have these loans of 100, these are your risky assets. Risk weight asset is basically what is a term. Government bond are not risky, so their weight is 0, so entire weight goes to this thing. So what they say is, for giving loans, I want you to have 10% of your assets, risky assets, to be kept as capital. So which in this case basically means you will have to keep 10. Then there is a economic capital, term called economic capital, where bank does its own analysis, because nobody knows bank's balance sheet better than that bank. They know what kind of loans they have given to what kind of people they have given, what is the current status of those people. So they know it better. So they may decide to have a different percentage. They may decide to have more than 10. So let's say they decide to have 12. Now economic capital can always be greater than risk capital. It can be equal to risk capital. It can never be less than, economic capital can be has to be greater than regulatory capital, not risk capital. Economic capital has to be greater than regulatory capital. It can be equal to regulatory capital, but it can never be less than regulatory capital. So this is basically kind of a threshold that regulator says at least have 10%. It's not, regulator does not say that you will have only 10%. It always says at least you will have 10% of your loans or 10% of your risk weighted asset as your capital. And depending upon banks and depending upon bank's owner, which is basically shareholder, they may decide that we want to be more conservative, we want to have slightly more capital than what regulator has asked for. Now the regulator's job is not to worry about banks' opportunity cost or loss to shareholders. Regulator's job is to ensure bank is safe. So if bank is holding more than 10, they are more than happy to let banks have more than 10. But it's not regulator's job to decide how profitable the bank should be. It's basically bank's owner's job. Regulator's job is to ensure that bank stays alive. Bank does not get bankrupt. Okay. Now, next thing is capital the only way of handling losses? Answer is no. For expected losses, so losses can be covered into expected and non-expected losses. And then there is a third bucket, which is extreme losses. So expected losses is basically the losses that you expect in due course of business. So if you have, let's say, given loans to 100 people and average size of a loan is, let's say, $1,000 is basically your average size, then as part of your lending business you expect, let's say, 2% of people will not pay back your loans. So which means 2 people will not pay back your loan, which means 2,000 will not be recovered. That's your expected loss. Anything over and above is, let's say there was a economic slowdown, or let's say there was a pandemic like coronavirus, and let's say instead of 2%, 5% people defaulted. So that's basically your unexpected loss. The additional 3% or additional 3,000 in our example basically becomes your unexpected loss. So expected loss you are expected to cover through your pricing. For example, a person who has good credit history, who has many years of, let's say, service ahead of us, a person who is, let's say, only 30 years old and he is in a good job and he has never defaulted on his credit card payments or anything, that person will be given loan at, let's say, 10%. But let's say there is a slightly older person, let's say around 50 years of age, he is into service, you know that that person will be retiring anytime. And let's say there is a person who has defaulted on his past loans or past credit card bills. So people with poor credit history, you will price them at higher rate. You can't price good credit history customer and poor credit history customer at same rate. Again, the concept is same. Your expected return are proportional to the risk. So your bank is taking a risk that this person may not be able to pay back its loan, but still bank is taking a risk of giving him that money. So it will expect more return. but reality may be that person may not pay back any money, so bank may not even earn any return. That's the real life. Okay, so question is why do then bank has to give loans to such kind of customers? Why can't it refuse? Few things. One is government pressure. You can't let a big section of society to not have banking service. For example, agriculture. If somebody is in agriculture, he is dependent upon rains, he is dependent upon climate, he is dependent upon weather, that weather is fine throughout the cultivation period. There are no storms, there are no cyclones, there is no excessive rain, there is no problem with irrigation. Okay, there is no bug attack. So agriculture is generally considered as risky. But then there is a government pressure that banks has to give agriculture loans also. Banks can't just simply say that I will give loan only to people working on automobile sector or in pharma industry. Bank has to give loans across the board because of one, government pressure. Two, even if there is no government pressure, there is a competition. So you may end up not giving loan to one person, but then somebody else will go and give loans to those person and might capture the market share that you would like to capture. So both government pressure as well as competition. You can't always return back these kind of customers. You have to take risk. For unexpected losses, we have already seen, we have discussed enough about capital. And then there is the third category, which is extreme losses. For that, you generally take insurance. And an example of extreme losses could be earthquake, floods, fire, terror attack. So all these things comes under extreme losses. Alright guys, that's all for today's session. We'll be starting discussion on Basel in next tutorial. Till then, thanks and all the best for your studies.